Tonight, on Fear Knocks, we're standing at the edge of the lot where maps are stapled under fogged plex, and every boot step sounds farther than it is. 10 first-hand accounts from runners, rangers, and night crews trace missing minutes right at the trailhead. Recovered audio, interval footage, and log notes that don't agree. We move from Appalachian footbridges to Pacific Northwest boardwalks, autumn air pooling under cedar, radios returning names the caller never said. No spoilers, just dates, weather, and the patterns that repeat. Loops that bring you back to the same guardrail, cameras that keep time while bodies don't, and signage that points both directions at once. Subscribe and hit the bell. If you've ever stood here after dark, this one's for you. Drop your own story below. We read them all. New cases every week. All right, let's get into it. I've been running the Switchback 18 loop in the Blue Ridge for 7 years. Every weekday morning, before the park office opens, I'm out there. 2 miles exactly. The trail starts at the kiosk by the parking lot, climbs a gentle incline, crosses the creek footbridge, loops back through a section of older growth and finishes where it began. I know every route, every rock, every yellow blaze marker. It's a ritual, a mental calibration before my shift at the regional planning office. This morning, October 17th, started like any other. My alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. I was in the lot by 5:58. The air was cool, around 40 degrees, with a light mist hanging over the creek upstream, visible even in the pre-dawn gloom. I noted a thin layer of frost on the metal rail of the kiosk display, a detail I always logged mentally. My Garmin Forerunner was charged, GPS locked. I hit start at 6:01 a.m. and began my run. The first mile felt good. My breath plumed in the cold air. I could smell the damp earth and the sharp, clean scent of pine needles underfoot, a smell that always brought me back to childhood camping trips. I hit the footbridge over the creek at 6:10 a.m., a familiar landmark. The mist was thicker here, clinging to the water. I remembered a run last spring, the sunlight glinting off the water, a perfect, effortless stride. Today, my legs felt a bit heavy. Not quite my usual pace, but nothing alarming. Just an off day, I figured. My watch buzzed, signaling the 2-mile mark. I glanced down, 6:47 a.m. My heart rate was high, 155 BPM, but the elapsed time made me frown. 29 minutes. That was slow. My average for this loop is closer to 22 minutes. I chalked it up to feeling sluggish, maybe not enough sleep. I hit stop and walked the last few yards to my car, cooling down. Back in the driver's seat, I pulled out my phone to sync the run data. The Garmin Connect app loaded the activity. 2 miles, 29:03 elapsed time. Pace, 14:31 plus mile. Definitely off. But then I looked at the start time recorded by the app, 6:01 a.m., and the end time, 6:47:04 a.m. My eyes scanned the numbers again. 6:47 minus 6:01 is 47 minutes, not 29. My stomach tightened. I rebooted the watch, thinking it was a software glitch. Resynced. The data remained consistent. 29 minutes, 3 seconds of recorded activity. But the actual time on the watch, the time I saw when I hit stop, was 6:47 a.m. The discrepancy was 18 minutes. 18 minutes missing from the recorded run, yet accounted for in the real-world clock time. I pulled up the GPS track. It was perfect. A clean, unbroken line following the switchback 18 loop exactly. I overlaid it with yesterday's run. They were identical, pixel for pixel, following the yellow blazes precisely. There was no deviation, no pause long enough to account for 18 minutes. It was as if I'd run the full 2 miles in 29 minutes. But 47 minutes had passed on the clock. This was beyond a simple software error. I knew the park security camera logs the parking lot activity. As a volunteer for the Friends of Blue Ridge Trails, I had access to the archived footage for maintenance planning. I pulled up the feed for this morning. At 5:58:12 a.m., my car entered the lot. At 6:01:1 a.m., I was visible, framed by the kiosk, hitting start on my watch and beginning my run. The timestamp on the video feed advanced normally. 6:05, 6:15, 6:30. My car sat in the lot, empty. Then, at 6:47:04 a.m., I reappeared from the trail, stepping into the edge of the frame, walking towards my car. The camera's timestamp matched my watch's end time perfectly, but the details in the footage hit me with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the morning air. When I started at 6 a.m., the video showed the mist upstream of the creek, just as I'd observed. The frost on the kiosk rail was clearly visible, a thin white sheen. When I reappeared at 6:47 a.m., the mist was still there, perhaps a little thinner, but the frost on the kiosk rail was gone, melted by the rising sun. Yet, in the video, as I approached my car, my clothes were completely dry, not a single drop of moisture, no dampness from the mist, no indication I had just run through an area where frost had been present. My hair was neat, not even slightly damp from exertion or the ambient humidity. It was as if I had walked straight out of a climate-controlled room. The GPS track showed I ran the 2 miles. My watch recorded 29 minutes of activity. The park camera confirmed I was gone for 47 minutes and returned at 6:47 a.m., and it showed me returning dry, despite the conditions I'd run through, conditions that were still visible on the camera feed at the time of my return. The data didn't just contradict itself, it presented an impossible physical state. I sat in my car, reviewing the footage again, the digital timestamps mocking me, the perfect overlapping GPS track, now feeling like a cold, precise lie. 18 minutes, gone, leaving only a ghost of a run. My name is Sarah Miller. I've been a volunteer ranger with the Olympic National Park for 7 years now. Most of my work involves trail maintenance, visitor assistance, and routine data collection. It's quiet work, often solitary, which suits me. I know these trails, the way the light shifts through the old growth, the scent of the conifers after a rain. My background is in environmental science, but out here, it's more about practical application. Reading weather, tracking wildlife, keeping the peace. I've logged thousands of hours on these ridges, and I thought I'd seen most of what the park could throw at you. That was until last fall. It was a Tuesday, late October. The air had that crisp edge that signals winter isn't far off. My shift began at 0700. My assignment was a routine patrol of the High Ridge Trail, followed by a weather data collection sweep at the kiosk overlook. I carried my standard kit: GPS, first aid, water, a field radio, and the park-issued handheld weather meter. The kiosk overlook is about 5 miles in, accessible via a cedar boardwalk for the last half mile. It's a popular spot, offering panoramic views, and, importantly, it hosts one of our automated weather masts. My job was to manually verify its readings and log them into the system via the repeater. I reached the kiosk at 10:17. The sky was clear, but a strong wind was picking up from the west. The boardwalk planks, still damp from morning dew, creaked under my boots. I pulled out the handheld weather meter, a Kestrel 5500, and held it aloft, calibrating it against the ridge mast's anemometer. The mast itself is a slender aluminum pole, about 20 feet high, with a cup anemometer and a wind vane at the top. I recorded the ambient temperature, 48.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Relative humidity, 78%. And then the wind data. The Kestrel showed an average wind speed of 18 knots, with gusts peaking at 26 knots. I cross-referenced this with the mast's digital readout, which displayed similar figures. Everything seemed normal. The next step was to transmit the data. We use a VHF repeater system to relay information back to the main station at Hurricane Ridge. This ensures coverage even in the remote sections of the park. The protocol is simple. Key the mic, state your call sign, report your location, and then transmit the data. The repeater picks up your signal, amplifies it, and sends it on. It's a reliable system designed for clarity and efficiency. Every transmission is logged automatically at the main station, time-stamped and recorded. This creates an auditable trail for all park communications. I pulled out my Motorola APX 8000 portable radio. The kiosk has a small weatherproof speaker mounted on its side, part of an emergency broadcast system, but it also acts as a local relay for repeater traffic if set to a specific channel. I usually don't bother with it, preferring my earpiece, but today, for some reason, I toggled the kiosk's speaker on. Maybe it was the quiet, or just habit. I keyed the mic. Ranger Miller, Kilo Sierra 01, kiosk overlook, transmitting weather data. I released the mic button. A fraction of a second later, my own voice, slightly tinny, echoed from the kiosk speaker. Ranger Miller, Kilo Sierra 01, kiosk overlook, transmitting weather data. Then, a beat of static and a clear, synthesized voice, not my own, but distinctly machine-generated, came through. Gusts, 32 knots, ridge mast, 26. I froze. Gusts, 32 knots. My Kestrel and the mast had both read 26. I checked the Kestrel again, still 26. I looked up at the mast, its cup spinning steadily. No way it was hitting 32. And the voice. It wasn't the usual repeater squawk. It sounded direct, like it was coming from the kiosk itself, not relayed. My first thought was a glitch. Radio systems are complex, prone to interference, especially in mountainous terrain. Maybe a phantom signal, or some atmospheric skip. I keyed the mic again. Ranger Miller, Kilo Sierra 01. Repeat last transmission. Request clarification on wind data. I released the mic. My voice repeated from the K. My name is Mark Thorne, and for the past 17 years, I've worked as a canine handler for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Service. My partner is Ranger, a 7-year-old German Shepherd, and he's seen more backcountry than most people will in a lifetime. We've found lost hikers, located evidence, and sometimes, regrettably, recovered bodies. It's a job that demands precision, trust, and an absolute adherence to protocol. What happened on October 14th near the Roaring Fork Motor Trail, however, defied every protocol and every ounce of common sense I'd accumulated. The call came in at 06:15. A hiker, solo, overdue by 36 hours. Last known contact placed him near the Grotto Falls trailhead. Weather had been clear, but nighttime temperatures were dipping into the low 40s. Hypothermia was a concern. Ranger and I were on scene by 0800, geared up, ready to deploy. After a quick briefing from Incident Command, we were assigned a section of trail that looped around a dry creek bed, known for its dense rhododendron thickets and a short, sturdy civilian Conservation Corps bridge. The bridge was a local landmark, built from rough-hewn timber and stone, barely wide enough for a single ATV, spanning what was usually a trickle, but was now completely dry. Our starting point was a small, informal parking area, marked by a dented, rust-pocked guardrail where the trail officially began. I logged our entry time, 0847. Air temperature 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity 68%. Ranger was on a 15-foot lead, nose to the ground, tail working. He's a specialist in human remains detection. But we'd start with live find protocols, hoping for the best. The trail was well defined for the first quarter mile, winding through a mix of hemlock and oak. The ground was soft, a mix of damp earth and fallen leaves. Ranger worked methodically, his focus unwavering. I kept my eyes on his body language. My GPS unit clipped to my vest, marking waypoints every 100 yards. Around 9:10, Ranger's head snapped up. He pulled hard on the lead, a low whine rumbling in his chest. "Show me, boy," I murmured, tightening my grip. He led me off the main path, deeper into the undergrowth, towards the sound of the dry creek bed. The scent was there, faint but distinct. Human. We followed it for another 50 yards until we reached the CCC bridge. It was exactly as described. Rough stone abutments, heavy timber deck, a faint smell of creosote lingering in the cool air. The creek bed below was a jumble of smooth stones and sun-baked mud. Ranger moved onto the bridge, his paws making soft thuds on the timber. He crossed without hesitation, his nose still working the air, then the ground on the far side. I followed, noting the time 9:18. The trail continued, narrowing slightly, climbing a gentle incline. We tracked for another 10 minutes, maybe a quarter mile, before Ranger paused, lifting his head, looking back the way we'd come. This was unusual. He rarely broke focus unless the scent dissipated or shifted. "What is it, Ranger?" I whispered. He turned in a slow circle, then started pulling me back, not with the urgency of a fresh scent, but with a strange, almost confused determination. I checked my GPS. The breadcrumb trail showed a clear path forward. Still, I trusted Ranger's instincts more than any device. We retraced our steps. The return journey felt quicker than it should have. The trail seemed to flatten out sooner. Then, through a break in the trees, I saw it. The dented, rust-pocked guardrail. The informal parking area. Our starting point. My first thought was a navigational error, a loop I hadn't accounted for. But I'd studied the topo maps. This section was a clear out and back, not a loop. I pulled out my GPS unit. The track log showed a straight line, then a smooth U-turn, bringing us back to the exact same coordinates. But that wasn't right. We hadn't made a U-turn. We'd followed a path. I remember a brief, almost irrelevant thought flashing through my mind. How I'd hated cleaning the red clay mud from my boots after a particularly wet search near Gatlinburg last spring. This mud felt different, drier, almost powdery. I knelt beside the guardrail, checking the ground. There were our boot prints, mine and Ranger's, clearly visible in the damp earth. But something was off. The mud in the treads of my boots was fresh, light brown, from the creek bed after the bridge. The mud in the prints on the ground, however, was darker, almost black, and visibly drier, with small cracks in its surface. Like it had been there for hours, or even days, baked by the sun. Yet, the prints were undeniably ours. The tread pattern was an exact match. It was as if we had stepped into older versions of our own prints. Ranger, meanwhile, had planted himself. His hackles were raised, a low, guttural growl rumbling deep in his chest. He wasn't looking at the guardrail or the parking lot. His gaze was fixed on the path leading to the CCC bridge. He was rigid, every muscle tensed, a deep whine now replacing the growl. "Ranger, come, let's go." I tried to coax him forward, towards the bridge again. He wouldn't budge. He dug his claws into the earth, resisting my pull with all his strength. This was unprecedented. Ranger never refused a command, especially not on a scent track. My usual verbal cues, my gentle tugs on the lead, my encouragement. Nothing worked. He was terrified, or perhaps something else. He was refusing passage. I tried to radio incident command, but the signal was patchy. Static crackled over my earpiece. "Thorn to IC. Do you copy? Over." Nothing. Just the wind through the pines, and Ranger's low, persistent whine. I stood there, staring at the bridge, then at the impossible boot prints, then back at Ranger, who was now trembling. The air felt colder, heavier. The smell of pine needles, usually comforting, now seemed cloying, oppressive. I had a choice. Force Ranger, violating every canine handling protocol, or retreat. "Okay, boy," I said, my voice sounding thin. "We're not going that way." I turned, pulling Ranger away from the path, towards the parking lot. He resisted for a few steps, then, as if a spell had broken, he followed, still agitated, but moving. He didn't calm down until we reached the paved lot and were well clear of the trail. I logged our exit time, 9:45. The missing hiker was never found. The section of trail, including the CCC bridge, was cordoned off for further investigation. My GPS data showed a perfectly normal track. No loops, no sudden returns. Just a straight path in and a straight path out. But the memory of those boot prints, fresh mud over old, and Ranger's absolute refusal to cross that bridge again remains. It was as if the bridge itself had decided we weren't meant to pass, sending us back to where we started, leaving behind an impossible echo of our own passage. My name is Arthur Finch. I've been a freelance nature photographer for 15 years, specializing in long exposure and time-lapse work. I've shot everything from desert superblooms to Arctic aurora, but the Columbia River Gorge remains my favorite subject. There's a particular overlook, about a mile off the old scenic highway, that offers a dramatic view of the river winding through the basalt cliffs, especially at sunrise when the fog rolls in. That's where I was last month. The plan was a sunrise time-lapse. 20-second intervals, f11, ISO 100. Custom white balance for the pre-dawn glow. I'd set up my Canon 5D Mark IV on a sturdy Gitzo carbon fiber tripod, fitted with a 16 to 35 mm wide-angle lens, The intervalometer was programmed for a 6-hour run, starting at 0300. This allowed for the deep pre-dawn, the full sunrise, and the subsequent dissipation of the morning fog. I'd checked the weather. 90% chance of heavy fog, clearing by 0900, temperatures in the low 40s. Perfect conditions for the kind of atmospheric sequence I was after. My routine is meticulous. Double-check battery levels, memory card capacity, lens focus, and intervalometer programming. Before leaving the rig, I always take a final reference shot with my phone, time-stamped, showing the setup. It's a habit born from years of remote deployments. This time, I'd noted the camera's internal clock read 02:58:30. My phone read 02:58:35. Close enough. I hiked back to my truck, parked in the lower lot, and was on the road by 03:15, planning to return around 10. The following morning, I was back at the overlook by 09:45. The fog had indeed lifted, leaving behind a crisp, clear day. The air still carried the damp, earthy scent of wet pine needles and decaying leaves, a smell I've always associated with these early morning gorge shoots. The tripod was exactly where I'd left it, undisturbed. I packed up the gear, careful to avoid touching the lens or sensor, and headed back to the studio. Downloading the footage was routine. I imported the raw CR2 files into Lightroom, then assembled them in After Effects. The sequence began beautifully, star trails fading, the sky lightening to deep indigo, then the first tendrils of fog creeping up the gorge. The sunrise was spectacular, painting the mist in hues of orange and pink. Then I hit a snag. At precisely 05:42:18, according to the EXIF data, the entire frame shifted. Not a bump, not a tripod collapse, but a distinct, smooth refocus. The depth of field changed, pulling the distant cliffs sharper and blurring the immediate foreground slightly. This was impossible. The lens was set to manual focus, locked down. There was no autofocus motor engaged, no remote trigger. My core protocol for unattended time-lapse is absolute immobility and consistent focus. Any deviation indicates external interference. I scrubbed back and forth, frame by frame. The refocus was clear, but there was no figure, no hand, no shadow, no movement near the tripod. The 61 minutes of footage following this event, from 05:42:18 to 06:4300, showed nothing but dense, swirling fog, completely obscuring the overlook area. It was a thick, impenetrable blanket. I cross-referenced my dashcam footage from the truck. My dashcam, which logs continuously, showed me leaving the lower lot at 03:15. It also showed me returning at 09:55. But there was another clip. A short, 5-second segment, time-stamped 06:05:03. It showed me getting into the truck. My jacket cuffs were visibly damp, glistening with moisture. But my hiking boots, which I could clearly see as I swung my legs in, were remarkably clean and dry. This didn't make sense. If I'd been up at the overlook in dense fog at 06:05, my boots should have been soaked, covered in mud and dew from the mile-long spur trail. I remembered the feeling of the cold metallic door handle against my palm as I pulled it open that morning, a detail that now felt like a phantom limb. I checked my personal logbook. No entry for a mid-morning return. My phone's GPS data confirmed I was at home, asleep, between 0400 and 0900. The dashcam's internal clock is regularly synced to GPS, so it's usually reliable. The camera's internal clock, I realized with a jolt, I hadn't synced to an atomic clock in weeks, relying instead on its general accuracy and my phone's timestamp for the initial setup. A minor oversight, but a significant one now. The next day I drove back to the gorge. I hiked the mile spur trail from the lower lot to the overlook, specifically around 0600. The ground was still damp from the previous day's fog, but not muddy. If I had walked that trail, my boots would have picked up moisture and some grit. I walked the precise path, checking for any disturbance, any impression that might have been left. Nothing. The soil was a mix of compacted dirt and small stones, holding no clear prints. I even brought a small drone to survey the area from above, looking for any anomaly in the vegetation. The drone's rotors hummed, a surprisingly loud mechanical buzz in the otherwise quiet morning. It was an irrelevant detail, but it stuck with me. Back at the studio, I ran a full diagnostic on the camera and lens. Both passed. No errors, no signs of tampering. The refocus event at 5:42:18 was an internal camera function, triggered by something. The continuous capture protocol, which relies on the camera operating autonomously and without external input, had demonstrably failed. My entire process is built on the premise that the equipment, once set, operates predictably. This was a direct contradiction. The dashcam footage of me getting into the truck at 6:05:03 was undeniable. My face was visible, tired, but unmistakably mine. The damp cuffs, the clean boots, the 61 minutes of fog on the camera, devoid of any human presence, yet punctuated by a mechanical refocus. It presented a paradox. I was observed at the truck, having been at the overlook, yet the camera at the overlook recorded no one. My personal memory of being asleep, juxtaposed with the dashcam evidence, created a profound disjunction. I still have the footage. It sits in a folder on my drive, labeled Gorge Anomaly. The time-lapse sequence is beautiful up until 5:42:18. Then it becomes a 61-minute blur of white and gray, ending abruptly at 6:4300 when the fog began to thin. The dashcam clip is also there. Two pieces of evidence, both undeniable, both contradicting each other. I can't explain it. I can't publish it. It's just a gap, a missing hour of coherent reality, captured and then lost in the mist. I'm Ben Carter. Been a trail crew sawyer for the Forest Service for going on 18 years now. Most of that time in Pisgah, specifically the Appalachian Ranger District. I've seen my share of blowdown, mudslides, and washed-out trails. It's hard work, physically demanding, but there's a quiet satisfaction to it. You're out there, in the deep woods, making things right again after a storm. You learn to trust your gear, your partner, and your instincts. This past fall, after a particularly nasty tropical depression spun up the coast and dumped a week's worth of rain on the mountains, we had a lot of work. Trees were down everywhere, especially on the exposed ridges. One Tuesday morning, Mike Jensen, my partner, and I were assigned to clear a section of the Art Loeb Trail, specifically a spur ridge above the Davidson River. It was a steep climb just to get to the work site. The forecast called for scattered gusts up to 25 miles per hour, clearing by afternoon. We parked the truck at the trailhead pull-off, about a mile from where the worst of the blowdown started. After a quick safety brief and a check of our comms, we geared up. Still MS-462s, fuel, oil, felling wedges, first aid kits, and the usual PPE. Chaps, helmets, ear protection. The air was cool, damp, with a sharp scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. A gust of wind rustled the high canopy, sending a shower of water droplets down onto my helmet. Our protocol for heavy blowdown on steep terrain is strict. One sawyer actively cutting, the other acting as a spotter and swamping out cut material, always maintaining visual or immediate radio contact. We work in a leapfrog pattern, clearing a section, then moving up. Mike took point with the clearing, while I started on the first big oak that had snapped mid-trunk. He moved down slope, clearing smaller debris. I could hear his saw occasionally, a distant growl amidst the wind. I was focused on the cut, the chain biting into the wet wood. The MS-462 is a powerful saw, but a 30-inch oak requires concentration. The wind was a constant factor, pushing down slope, making the saw's exhaust plume whip around. I had my helmet's ear protection engaged, as always, but you learn to filter the roar of the engine, to listen for changes in the wood, for the shift of a branch, for your partner's radio call. The wind was definitely coming from above me, down the ridge, carrying the sound of the forest down towards the valley. I was about halfway through the trunk when it happened. A sudden, sharp gust hit the ridge. Through the roar of the saw, a voice, faint but distinct, cut through. "Ben!" It sounded like Mike. It came from upslope, from somewhere above me on the ridge. My grip tightened on the saw. I hesitated, then dismissed it. Must be the wind, playing tricks with the sound. Fatigue, maybe. I'd been up since 4 a.m. I pushed the thought away and leaned back into the cut. Then, the saw died. Not a sputter, not a cough. Just an abrupt, total silence. Like someone had flipped a switch. The sudden absence of noise was jarring, leaving only the rush of the downslope wind and the drip of water from the trees. The saw felt heavy and inert in my hands. I pulled the chain brake, checked the kill switch. Both were in the run position. I tried to restart it. The pull cord moved freely, but the engine wouldn't catch. I checked the fuel gauge. Full. I looked upslope, scanning the tree line. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. The ridge was empty. "Mike?" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the sudden quiet. No answer. I pulled my radio from my chest harness. "Mike, you there?" A moment of static, then Mike's voice, clear and unconcerned. "Yeah, Ben. Thought I heard your saw quit. Everything all right?" "Saw just died on me. I thought I heard you call my name from upslope." Mike chuckled. "Nah, man, I'm still by the truck. Just finished clearing that last section of saplings. Gonna grab some water." My stomach tightened. Mike was by the truck. That was almost a mile down the trail, not upslope. And the wind was blowing downslope. How could I have heard his voice, or a voice, from upslope against the wind? I must have imagined it. The mind does strange things in isolation, especially when you're tired. I remembered a time, years ago, when I swore I saw a black bear standing upright in a clearing, only for it to resolve into a burnt stump after a few blinks. I tried the saw again. Nothing. I checked the spark plug, pulled the air filter. Everything looked normal. This wasn't a simple stall. I couldn't fix it here. I made the call. "Saw's dead, Mike. I'm hiking back to the truck. Gonna grab the backup." "Copy that, Ben. I'll be waiting." Leaving a saw in the field is against protocol. You fix it or you carry it out. But this was a heavy MS-462, and I was a mile up a steep ridge. My pack was already heavy. I secured the saw to a fallen log, tucking it under a thick rhododendron bush, marking its GPS coordinates on my handheld. I would retrieve it later. It felt wrong, but the priority was getting a working saw and continuing the job. The silence on the hike back was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the leaves and the persistent downslope wind. The sunlight dappled through the canopy, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor, picking out the iridescent green of moss on a rotting log. I thought about the simple pleasure of a cold beer and a hot burger after a long day, a stark contrast to the unsettling quiet I was walking through. When I reached the truck, Mike was leaning against the fender, sipping from his water bottle. "What was the deal?" he asked. "No idea. Just cut out. Wouldn't restart." I walked to the tool cache mounted on the truck bed. It's a locked aluminum box where we keep spare chains, tools, and backup saws. We keep a logbook for everything that goes in and out. It's a critical part of. My name is Mark Jensen, and I've been a patrol ranger with the Forest Service for 15 years, all of it spent on the slopes of Mount Hood. Most people only see Hood in the summer, when the trails are clear and the sun hits the alpine meadows. My job often starts when the crowds leave, tracking weather systems, checking trail registers, and securing access points as the seasons turn. Early winter is always a shift, a quiet period before the heavy snows really lock everything down. This particular day, November 14th, felt like a transition. The first real snow of the season had fallen overnight, a light, dry powder that coated the upper elevations and dusted the lower trailheads. I was running my usual route, checking the White River West trailhead, about 4,000 feet up. My patrol truck, a Ford F-250, handled the fresh inch of snow on the access road without issue. The air temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, wind negligible. I pulled into the empty parking lot at 8:35. No other vehicles. This wasn't unusual for a weekday after the first snow, but it always put me on alert. My standard procedure: check the lot, then the kiosk, then the register. The kiosk was a standard Forest Service design, weathered timber frame, plexiglass map case, and a small metal register box bolted to the side. The restrooms were already locked for the season, a chain across the door handles. I walked toward the kiosk, my boots crunching softly on the fresh snow. That's when I saw them. Footprints. One set. They circled the kiosk, not just once, but 3 distinct, overlapping circuits in the pristine snow. The prints were clear, defined. A size 9 or 10 boot, good tread. They started near the register box, went around the entire structure, then back to the register, then repeated. 3 full loops. They ended behind the map case, directly opposite the register. It was an odd pattern, like someone pacing, or perhaps examining the kiosk from every angle. I knelt, pulling a small plastic ruler from my pack to gauge print depth. Approximately half an inch, consistent with the light snow cover. The edges were crisp, no melt, no wind drift. They were fresh, made after the snow had stopped sometime in the pre-dawn hours. I opened the register box. Inside, the logbook was damp at the edges, but the top page was dry. One entry, dated November 14th, 07:15. Sarah Jenkins, solo day hike, Timberline Trail East. Below that, a phone number and emergency contact. My initial thought was confusion. If Sarah signed in at 07:15 and these prints were hers, where was her vehicle? I'd seen no tracks on the access road beyond my own. My protocol, ingrained after years, was to cross-reference register entries with vehicles in the lot. This was a clear break. I stood up, scanning the lot again. Nothing. Not a single tire track besides my truck's. I checked the small pull-offs further down the access road where someone might try to hide a vehicle. Empty. The gate a quarter-mile back was still open, but it would be chained shut by noon for the winter. I walked around the kiosk, following the strange circuit of prints. As I reached the back, where the print stopped, I noticed a subtle mark on the plexiglass of the map case. A faint, circular smudge, like a gloved knuckle had tapped it. Just one tap. It was a detail so small, so specific, that it felt out of place. Almost performative. I ran my gloved hand over it, feeling the cold, smooth surface. The image of the tap, the 3 circles, the single entry, and the empty lot started to form a knot in my stomach. I remembered once, years ago, on a summer day, I'd watched a family of deer graze peacefully in this very lot, completely unfazed by my presence. That memory, sun-drenched and calm, felt impossibly distant now. I radioed dispatch at 0902. Jensen, White River West. Single register entry, Sarah Jenkins, 0715. No vehicle present. Requesting a check on the number provided. Dispatch acknowledged, their voice crackling slightly. The signal here was always hit or miss, a known dead zone for some frequencies, a detail I often forgot until I needed it most. My handheld GPS showed a weak satellite lock. While I waited, I decided to walk the first half-mile of the Timberline Trail, just to see if I could find any more prints, any sign of Sarah. The trail was covered in the same light snow, unbroken. Nothing. It was as if she had signed the register, walked around the kiosk, tapped the plexiglass, and then simply vanished. This was the first time my check for tracks protocol had yielded such a bizarre absence. At 0935, dispatch called back. Jensen, negative on the contact number, goes straight to voicemail. Emergency contact, also voicemail. My heart sank a little. This was escalating. Any other vehicles reported in the area? I asked. Negative, Jensen. No other calls. I decided to expand my search. I drove slowly back down the access road, my gaze sweeping the tree line, checking every ditch and dense thicket. About 3/4 of a mile from the trailhead, just past a thick stand of lodgepole pines, I saw it. A dark blue Subaru Forester, partially obscured by the trees, pulled off the road into a shallow ditch. The driver's side door was ajar. I pulled my truck over, deploying my emergency lights. The Subaru's windows were fogged over from the cold. I approached cautiously, hand on my sidearm, scanning the immediate area. No movement. No sounds beyond the wind rustling the pine needles. The license plate matched the vehicle description for Sarah Jenkins, provided by dispatch after they ran her emergency contact. The interior was neat. A hiking pack was on the passenger seat, along with a half-eaten granola bar. The keys were in the ignition. The engine was cold. My eyes went to the trunk. It was slightly ajar, not fully latched. I pulled it open. The trunk was mostly empty, save for a small first aid kit and a spare tire. But one specific item was missing: the tire chains. I knew this because I could see the outlines where they had rested, a slight depression in the trunk liner. More importantly, the owner's manual for the Subaru was open on the back seat, folded to the page detailing how to install tire chains. The pieces clicked, but formed an impossible picture. Sarah Jenkins arrives, signs the register at 07:15. Her vehicle is found 3/4 of a mile away, abandoned, with the trunk open and tire chains missing. Yet there are no vehicle tracks in the snow leading from the trailhead to this spot, only my own, and the prints around the kiosk are fresh, made after the snow fell. It meant either Sarah had driven to the trailhead, signed in, then walked back to her car, driven it down the road, abandoned it, and then walked back to the trailhead without leaving any tracks in the snow, only to vanish. Or someone else was involved. Someone who had driven her car, taken her chains, and then somehow left no trace of their own vehicle. The single set of prints circling the kiosk, the precise tap on the plexiglass, the missing chains. It was too deliberate, too specific to be a simple lost hiker. The snow had started to fall again, light flakes obscuring the tracks I had so carefully documented. I stood there, looking at the empty trunk, the open manual, and the fresh snow. My radio now just static. The cold was starting to bite. My name is Elias Vance. I've been a National Park Ranger for 22 years, the last 15 of them here in the Wind River Range. My primary duties involve backcountry patrol and hydrological assessment. I know these rivers and creeks like the back of my hand. From the high alpine runoff to the low elevation fishing runs. I've seen everything from flash floods that cut new channels overnight to drought conditions that expose bedrock normally submerged for decades. My job is to monitor, to protect, and to respond. This particular morning, the sun was just clearing the eastern ridge, painting the upper peaks in a sharp gold. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I was on my routine patrol along the Willow Creek drainage, heading for USGS Station ID WHL007. It's a critical sensor point, a pressure transducer installed beneath a footbridge that spans a narrow, deep run of the creek. The data from these stations feeds directly into our central monitoring system, providing real-time water levels and flow rates. It's the first line of defense against unexpected surges, especially with the spring melt still unpredictable at higher elevations. My handheld telemetry unit, a ruggedized device I've carried for years, vibrated sharply at 0718. An alert. Willow Creek, WHL007. I glanced at the screen. Level anomaly detected. Rise, plus 2.0 feet. Rate, 0.5 feet per minute. 2 feet. That was significant. A rapid 2-foot rise in Willow Creek typically meant a flash flood warning, or at minimum, an immediate advisory for all downstream users. My protocol in such a scenario was clear. Confirm the reading, then immediately issue a Level 2 advisory. To dispatch for broadcast and begin an upstream visual assessment. I picked up my pace. The creek was only another half-mile downstream. As I approached, the sound of the water was a gentle murmur, not the rushing roar a 2-foot rise would produce. I could see the footbridge, a simple wooden structure with metal handrails, spanning the creek. Below it, on a small gravel bar, 2 figures were fishing. Kids, probably siblings, given their similar build and shared tackle box. They cast their lines with practiced, languid movements. The water around them looked perfectly calm. It barely ruffled the fallen leaves caught along the bank. The discrepancy was immediate, stark. I reached the footbridge at 0725. The telemetry unit in my hand still displayed the plus 2.0 foot rise. I walked directly to the gauge box, a small, locked metal enclosure bolted to the bridge pilaster. I unlocked it with my multi-tool, the hinges groaning slightly. Inside, the digital display on the transducer's control unit mirrored the telemetry. Current level, 14.8 feet. Base 12.8 feet. Change, plus 2.0 feet. The internal log confirmed the rapid increase starting at 0717. Every piece of equipment, from the submerged sensor to the satellite uplink, indicated a significant and sudden rise in water level. Yet, the water below me was placid. I looked at the two anglers, a boy, perhaps 12, and a girl, maybe 10. They were focused on their lines, oblivious. The gravel bar they stood on was dry, well above the water line. If the creek had risen 2 feet, that bar would be partially submerged, their boots wet. "Morning," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. "Everything all right down there?" The boy looked up, squinting against the low sun. "Morning, Ranger. Yeah, good. Water's a bit low today, actually. Makes for good wading." "Low?" I asked, my brow furrowing. I briefly considered that my equipment might be faulty, an internal thought that went against years of trusting the data. My protocol for a confirmed 2-foot rise was firm: warn, then evacuate. But how could I evacuate people from a non-existent flood? This was the first time I'd ever truly hesitated to follow a clear directive. My training told me to trust the data, but my eyes and ears were screaming contradiction. This was my professional protocol that failed. I couldn't immediately act on the warning. "Yeah," the girl chimed in. "We crossed the bridge earlier, maybe 6:30. Boots stayed dry." I nodded slowly. "All right, just checking. Keep an eye on the water, all right?" I knew it sounded hollow. I decided to cross the footbridge to check the gauge box on the far bank, a less critical backup sensor, but still part of the system. My boots stayed dry on the wooden planks. The air was still, not a breath of wind. As I reached the middle of the bridge, I noticed something odd. The metal handrail, precisely at the midpoint, was glistening. Not with dew, which would have been uniform across the wood and metal. This was a distinct wetness, like fresh spray. It caught the sunlight, reflecting a momentary rainbow. I reached out and touched it. The metal was cold, slick with moisture. It felt like fine mist, but there was no mist. The water below was perfectly calm, barely a ripple, at least 5 feet beneath the rail. My mind wrestled with it. Condensation? But the air wasn't humid enough for that kind of buildup, not on a metal rail in direct sunlight. I pulled out my thermal sensor. Air temperature, 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Rail temperature, 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Creek water temperature, 46 degrees Fahrenheit. No significant temperature inversion that would cause localized condensation. Certainly not spray. I briefly considered a passing animal, but the wetness was too even, too fine. I even had a fleeting, irrelevant memory of my son, years ago, excitedly splashing in a puddle during a summer storm. The spray catching the light just like this. The contrast of that simple, joyful memory against the growing unease here was jarring. I looked back at the gauge box. The digital display was still locked on plus 2.0 feet. I looked at the creek, still flowing gently, serenely. I looked at the wet rail. My minor mistake was trying to rationalize it away, thinking it must be an unusual form of dew, some atmospheric fluke I hadn't encountered. I blamed my own fatigue from a long patrol. I decided to double-check the primary gauge box. I walked back, my boots still dry. The anglers were still there, still casting. I unlocked the box again, leaning in to reread the display. As I did, the telemetry unit in my hand vibrated again. Another alert. I looked at the screen. WHL-007. Level anomaly detected. Rise, plus 3.0 feet. Rate, 0.5 feet per minute. 3 feet. I looked at the gauge box display. It had updated. Current level, 15.8 feet. Base, 12.8 feet. Change, plus 3.0 feet. I stood up straight, my heart beginning to thump. I looked at the water. It was still low, still calm. The leaves still rested undisturbed along the banks, but the gravel bar where the children had been fishing was empty. Their 2 fishing rods were propped against a large river stone, reels still attached, lines still cast into the still water. Their small red cooler sat beside them. No children, no footprints leading away through the pristine gravel. I spun around, looking up and down the creek, into the trees. Nothing. The silence was suddenly profound, broken only by the gentle murmur of the creek, which sounded impossibly quiet. I looked back at the footbridge rail. It wasn't just glistening now, it was dripping. Slow, deliberate drops of water were forming and falling from the underside of the metal, hitting the wooden planks with tiny, wet taps. I checked my watch. 7:38. I keyed my comms radio. Dispatch, this is Ranger Vance, WHL-007 location. I have a critical hydrological anomaly and 2 missing persons, presumed anglers. Request immediate response team and aerial support. My current data indicates a 3-foot rise in Willow Creek, but visual assessment shows no change in water level. Footbridge handrail is actively dripping, but the creek itself is calm. Angler's gear is present, but they are not. There was a pause, then dispatch's voice, tinged with confusion. Ranger. My name is Ben Carter. I've been a land surveyor and mapper for the U.S. Forest Service for the better part of 14 years, mostly out here in the Cascades. My job is to walk the ground, establish control points and lay out lines for everything from timber harvest boundaries to trail reroutes. It's methodical work, precise work. You learn to trust your equipment, your process, and your own 2 eyes. Most days it's just me, a handheld GPS unit, a bag of stakes, and a notebook. This past fall I was tasked with establishing ground control points for a LiDAR aerial survey in a section of old-growth timber near the North Fork. The goal was to get an accurate canopy height model for fire risk assessment. My route was a simple, roughly rectangular loop, designed to give the aircraft clear targets. I started at the old Ranger kiosk, a weathered cedar structure where the paved road turns to gravel. My first 5 points were straightforward, marked with orange plastic stakes driven flush with the ground. Each one recorded in my Trimble G07X handheld unit, and then transcribed into my waterproof, write-in-the-rain notebook. The air was crisp, smelling of wet earth and pine needles. A good day for field work. Point 6 was at the edge of a small clearing. Point 7, a short distance into the tree line. Everything was proceeding as expected. I logged point 8, double-checked the coordinates against the handheld's display, and drove the stake. Then I moved on, aiming for the next pre-planned coordinate. I looked down at the handheld. The display, which should have read waypoint 9, now showed waypoint 10. I blinked. That's not right. My finger hovered over the screen. I'd just logged 8. I hadn't skipped anything. I tapped the back button, then forward. It still displayed waypoint 10. I checked my notebook, where I'd already written WP8 and its coordinates. I hadn't written WP9 yet. My thumb scrolled through the unit's internal log. It showed waypoint 1, 2, 3, 8, then 10. No 9. Huh, I muttered, pulling out my stylus. I'd been out since dawn. Maybe I was just tired. I'd driven past a roadside diner on the way up, and the smell of bacon had made my stomach rumble. My mind drifted for a second, thinking about my daughter's wonky treasure map she'd drawn last week. How she'd skipped numbers and drawn a path that doubled back on itself. This was different. This was professional equipment. I decided to reevaluate the current position. I let the unit reacquire its satellite lock, which it did within seconds, showing a 0.8 meter accuracy. I pressed the new waypoint button. The unit assigned the next available number. This time, it showed waypoint 9. Okay, I thought, a weird glitch, maybe a momentary software hiccup. I recorded the coordinates, drove the stake, and wrote WP9 in my notebook, along with the timestamp, 11:17 a.m. I moved forward, maybe 20 yards, towards where the next point was plotted on my topo map. I looked down at the handheld again to confirm my bearing. The screen now read, waypoint 9. Again, my brow furrowed. I hadn't pressed new waypoint again. I hadn't done anything but walk. The display was showing the same waypoint number, 9, but in a new location. I checked the coordinates. They were different from the previous WP9. Distinctly different. I scrolled back through the log. It showed WP8, logged at 11:12 a.m. WP9, logged at 11:17 a.m. And then another WP9, with a new timestamp, 11:20 a.m. This was a problem. My core protocol dictates unique sequential waypoint numbering. Every point has to be distinct. A duplicate number, especially in the middle of a sequence, would invalidate the entire LiDAR dataset for this section. I sighed, pulling out my pen. I wrote WP9 relog in my notebook, adding the new coordinates and timestamp. I drove a second stake, right next to the first, marking it with a small B in permanent marker. I'd have to go back and delete the first WP9 entry from the handheld later, or at least flag it as an error. For now, I just needed to keep moving. I continued, logging WP10, 11, and 12 without incident. The sun was getting higher, dappling through the canopy. But the initial anomaly had rattled me. I found myself double-checking every waypoint, every coordinate, every entry in my notebook. This hypervigilance made me notice something else. The line I was laying out, which was supposed to be relatively straight, following a gentle ridgeline, was starting to curve. Not a subtle curve, like a natural contour, but a definite, almost deliberate arc. It was veering off the planned path, deeper into a section of dense, secondary growth timber that wasn't supposed to be part of the survey block. My internal topo map, which I'd loaded onto the handheld, showed my current position clearly outside the intended boundary. I stopped, pulling out my printed paper map, unfolded and creased. I oriented it with my compass. My current position, according to the GPS, was a good 70 yards off the plotted line. This wasn't just a deviation, it was a significant error. But the handheld, usually so precise, showed my current waypoint as perfectly aligned with the new curving path. It was as if the handheld was creating its own new parallel survey line. I walked back to waypoint 12, then 11, then 10. Each stake was exactly where the handheld said it should be, but the line they formed was wrong. I considered abandoning the line and starting over from the last confirmed good point, waypoint 8. But that would mean losing hours of work, and I was already behind schedule. My supervisor wouldn't be pleased. I made a judgment call. A small mistake, born of fatigue and a desire to avoid a reprimand. I decided to continue, trusting that I could correct the overall data later, perhaps by running a new, shorter line to reconnect to the planned path. This was a deviation from protocol. You don't continue a line when you know it's fundamentally off course. I pressed on. The stakes now led me into a thicket of young firs, branches scraping against my pack. The ground became uneven, covered in mossy rocks. The arc tightened. I was logging points 15, 16, 17, each one further into the unexpected curve. The forest around me felt denser, quieter. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy. Then, through a break in the trees, I saw something. A flash of weathered cedar. It couldn't be. My heart started to pound. I pushed through the last few branches, ducking under a low-hanging limb. I stood in a small clearing, and there it was, the old ranger kiosk. The cedar walls, the faded interpretive sign, the small gravel parking area. My starting point. But I was approaching it from the wrong side. My survey line, which should have been a wide open rectangle, had curved in a complete impossible circle, leading me back to where I began. Not just back, but behind the kiosk, where there was no trail, no road, just dense forest. I stared at the kiosk, then at the last stake I'd driven, waypoint 17, barely 20 feet from the back wall. My handheld read waypoint 17 with its coordinates. I scrolled back through the log. WP 16, 15, all the way back to the second WP 9, then the first WP 9, then WP 8. The log was complete, sequential, and accounted for every physical stake I'd driven. But the physical reality contradicted the map in my hand. And the map in my hand contradicted the physical stakes. I pulled out my notebook. I flipped through the pages. There, in my own handwriting, was WP9 at 11:17 a.m. And then, a few lines down, WP9, relog, at 11:20 a.m. The coordinates next to them were different. My own notes confirmed the impossible duplication, and the coordinates for WP17, the last stake, showed it to be exactly where I was standing now, behind the kiosk, even though the overall path described a spatial loop that could not exist. I walked around the kiosk, back to the front, to where I'd driven waypoint 1, my starting point. I stood between WP1 and WP17, the beginning and the end of a loop that had no business being there. The air felt heavy. I looked at the handheld, then at the kiosk, then at the line of orange stakes curving away into the trees, an impossible arc. The data, the physical evidence, and my own memory were all in conflict, each one confirming an impossible reality. I didn't know which to trust, or what to report. All I knew was that I was standing in two places at once, and my map was a lie. My name is David Miller. I've been an electrical maintenance technician for the county for 15 years now, mostly handling the rural grid and public facilities. My partner, Mark, has been with the department for 2 years, fresh out of trade school, but sharp. Tonight we were out near the old Blackwood Canyon overlook, responding to a tripped breaker for the parking lot lights. It was just after 2300, the air already thick with the damp scent of pine needles from the surrounding forest, and the kind of dark that swallows your high beams. The lot itself was a simple gravel rectangle, maybe 50 by 80 feet, lined with 6 tall poles, each topped with a sodium vapor lamp. Standard setup. When we pulled in, the only illumination came from the faint glow of the distant highway and our truck's auxiliary lights. No moon. The job was routine. Isolate the circuit, verify the fault, replace the breaker, test. We'd done it hundreds of times. Looks like the main feed to the lot lights. Breaker 3A, Mark said, consulting the service schematic on his tablet. He had the younger eyes, better for reading schematics in the truck cab's dim light. All right, Mark, you pull the panel cover. I'll get the lockout kit and the multimeter. I grabbed the red plastic lockout device and my fluke from the back bin. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the concrete utility kiosk at the edge of the lot. The kiosk housed the main breaker panel and a small solar array controller for an auxiliary emergency beacon, though the beacon itself was powered by a separate, dedicated circuit. Mark already had the cover off, revealing the neat rows of breakers. The one labeled lot lighting was clearly tripped, its toggle switch resting in the middle position. I verified no voltage on the load side with my multimeter, then applied the lockout. Safety protocol. Always. Looks like a simple overload, Dave. Maybe a surge from the storm last week finally blew it, Mark suggested, already reaching for the replacement breaker from our spares box. I nodded. Could be. Or just end of life. These old 30-amp GFCIs can be finicky. As Mark inserted the new breaker into its slot, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible flicker from one of the distant lamp poles. It was so quick I almost dismissed it, attributing it to my own fatigue or a phantom reflection off the truck's chrome. I'd been on call for 36 hours straight, and my eyes were starting to play tricks. A small mistake, not logging that initial observation. Mark secured the breaker, double-checked the connections, and then, with a confident click, flipped the switch to on. The 6 sodium lamps across the lot sputtered, then flared to life, casting their familiar orange glow across the gravel. The sudden light pushed back the oppressive darkness. For a moment, everything was normal. Then, it wasn't. 10 seconds after the lights came on, they collectively dimmed, a noticeable drop in output, then brightened back to full intensity. It wasn't a flicker this time. It was a deliberate, synchronized pulse. Whoa, you see that, Dave? Mark asked, his voice tight. Yeah, 10 seconds. Let's wait. I watched my wrist-mounted watch. Sure enough, 10 seconds later the lights dimmed again, then returned. All right, something's definitely off. Check the voltage and current at the breaker again. See if there's a dip during the pulse. Mark ran the tests. Voltage is stable, Dave. Current draw is consistent. No drops during the pulse. It's like the lamps themselves are just dimming. He sounded perplexed. Doesn't make sense. Ballasts don't dim like that in unison. Not without a voltage drop. I thought about the solar array. Let's check the solar meter at the kiosk. Maybe the grid feed is fine, but the auxiliary system is feeding back weirdly. It was a long shot, but we had to rule it out. We walked over to the small wall-mounted display for the solar array. The LCD screen glowed green. System status: online. Battery: 100%. Output, nominal. Everything indicated a perfectly healthy solar system. No anomalies. As we stood there, looking at the meter, the pulsing of the lot lights outside accelerated. Now, the cycle was noticeably faster. We both turned to look. 5 seconds. Dim, then full. 5 seconds. Dim, then full. It was rhythmic, like a metronome. "Okay, this is new," Mark said, pulling out his phone. "I'm going to record this. What time is it?" I glanced at my watch. 00:17. Mark checked his phone. "My phone says 00:14. 3 minutes off." "What? No way." My truck's analog clock, which I'd synced with a GPS signal earlier, read 00:17. I pulled out my own phone. It also read 00:14. We both looked at each other. My phone had just been synced via cellular network. This was impossible. "Try logging the pulses on your phone, Mark. Note the timestamps." I instructed, but even as I said it, I knew it would be useless. If our phones were drifting, the timestamps would be meaningless. This was a direct violation of our standard logging protocol, which required precise, verifiable timestamps for all observations. We couldn't trust our primary recording devices. We walked back to the utility kiosk, the rhythmic dimming and brightening of the lot lights now a constant, unsettling presence. As we approached, the cycle accelerated again. Now it was a rapid 3-second pulse. Dim, full, dim, full. The lights were almost strobing. The air felt colder despite the lack of wind. I remembered a summer evening, years ago, changing a simple incandescent bulb in my kitchen. The satisfying click, the immediate, steady glow. No fuss, no mystery. Just light. That memory felt impossibly distant now. "Dave, my phone's at 0:21 now. The truck clock is 0:27. Mark's voice was barely a whisper. The 6-minute discrepancy was significant. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it's a localized EMP affecting our phones, but not the truck's mechanical clock or the grid itself. It sounded weak, even to me. The pulsing intensified further. The dim phase of the cycle became almost completely off. The lights were now just flashing on for a fraction of a second, then going dark for almost the full 3 seconds, before flashing on again. It was like a mechanical countdown, but without any visible mechanism. A rapid, silent count, punctuated by light. "We need to cut the power," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "This isn't an electrical fault. Something else is happening." I moved to the breaker panel, my hands steady despite the knot in my stomach. I flipped the main breaker for the lot lights, cutting off the power from the grid, from the solar array, from everything we controlled. The lot should have plunged back into total darkness. It didn't. The 6 sodium lamps continued their rapid 3-second pulse. Dim, full, dim, full. Drawing power from nowhere. The truck clock still read 00:29. Mark's phone showed 00:22. My phone 00:21. The time skew was growing, our devices diverging from reality. We stood there, watching the impossible. The lights continued their phantom, rhythmic countdown, powered by nothing. We had no protocol for this, no explanation. We just secured the kiosk, left the main breaker for the lot lights in the off position, and drove away. The strobing orange pulses shrinking in our rearview mirror until they were just a distant, unsettling beat against the vast, dark wilderness. We filed a report, but the logs from our phones were too inconsistent to be useful, and our own observations sounded like madness. The county closed the lot indefinitely. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I've been a backcountry ranger for Olympic National Park for 16 years. Most of that time has been spent in the Hoh Rainforest District, a place where the air itself feels ancient, heavy with moisture, and the scent of decay and growth. My job covers a lot of ground, from trail maintenance and emergency response to the less glamorous but equally critical administrative tasks. Managing permits, checking the automated trail cameras, and logging data. It's a job that demands precision, because out here, even a small oversight can have serious consequences. A few months ago, I was cycling through the routine task of reviewing footage from the trailhead kiosk camera. This particular camera, a robust Bushnell Core DS, is mounted discreetly above the permit box at the main Hoh River trailhead. Its primary function is to log every party entering the wilderness. It triggers on motion, records a 30-second clip, and timestamps it. It's a crucial tool for safety and compliance, allowing us to verify head counts against permits and provide a last known point for overdue parties. I pull the SD card weekly, upload the files to our server, and cross-reference them with the permit database. It's usually a straightforward process. On this particular Tuesday, the kiosk had that distinct, earthy smell of ozone lingering after a morning shower, a scent I always associate with the deep forest. I just finished a cup of coffee, black, from my chipped enamel mug, a gift from my daughter years ago. I remember thinking about the upcoming trail work schedule, already mentally prioritizing sections that needed attention. I loaded the footage from the previous week. The first few hours of each day's footage are often uneventful. Just the occasional deer or elk wandering past before the first hikers arrive. I was sifting through the early morning hours of October 14th. The permit log showed a party of two. A couple named Eleanor and David Vance, scheduled to enter the Hoh River Trail at dawn, aiming for a 3-day, 2-night trip to Elk Lake. Their permit, 10-14HOH007, was signed out the previous afternoon. I knew their faces from the permit photo. They were both in their late 20s, wearing bright blue rain jackets. At 06:12:03, the camera triggered. The footage showed the Vances, just as expected. They were walking past the kiosk, packs loaded, heading onto the trail. Eleanor was a step ahead, David a few paces behind, pulling his pack straps tighter. The timestamp was clear, 06:12:03 a.m. I logged their entry against their permit number, noting the visual confirmation. Standard procedure. I continued reviewing the footage, fast-forwarding through the next hour of empty trail. Then, at 06:12:03 a.m., the camera triggered again. I paused, thinking it was a glitch in the playback software, a stutter, or perhaps I'd accidentally rewound. I clicked back, then forward. No, it wasn't a playback error. It was a distinct file. The timestamp was identical, 06:12:03 a.m. And in the frame, walking past the kiosk, were Eleanor and David Vance. Same bright blue rain jackets, same packs. Eleanor a step ahead, David a few paces behind, pulling his pack straps tighter. The angle was identical, the lighting consistent. Everything about the frame was exactly the same. My first thought was a corrupted file. It happens. Sometimes, the camera writes a duplicate, or the SD card glitches. I pulled up the file properties for both video clips. Both were 30-second MP4s. File sizes were within standard deviation for a 30-second clip. Creation dates, modification dates, all identical, down to the second. But they were distinct files. Not a single file played twice. The system had recorded two separate, identical events at the exact same moment. I went back to the raw SD card, bypassing the server upload. I inserted it into my workstation. I navigated to the October 14th directory. The two files were there, side by side. HOH_1014_061203_A.mp4 and HOH_1014_061203_B.mp4. No A or A in the actual file names, of course, just my mental distinction. The camera's internal log confirmed two separate triggers at the same second. This wasn't a software error on my end. This was what the camera recorded. I zoomed in, frame by frame. In the first clip, David Vance's left boot hit the gravel at frame 15. In the second clip, David Vance's left boot hit the gravel at frame 15. The subtle sway of Eleanor's pack, the way David adjusted his strap, it was all perfectly synchronized. It was like watching two identical reels of film, shot simultaneously from the same camera. But a single camera cannot record two distinct events at the same exact second. It's physically impossible for the sensor to capture two separate streams of data simultaneously and write them as two distinct files with identical timestamps, unless the events themselves were identical and simultaneous. My mind started cycling through possibilities. A twin couple? No, the permit only listed two names. A sophisticated hoax? Highly unlikely in this remote environment, and for what purpose? A camera malfunction? I'd never seen one produce two perfectly identical, distinct video files from a single trigger event. A double exposure? No, the files were clean, crisp, digital. I logged the anomaly, noting the duplicate entries and the identical timestamps. This was a violation of the one-party, one-entry principle that the camera system was designed to enforce. But it wasn't a violation in the sense of an unauthorized entry. It was a violation of physics. The Vances returned 3 days later, on schedule. I met them at the trailhead, ostensibly to check their permit and ask about trail conditions. But really, I wanted to see them, to talk to them. They looked tired, but happy. "Everything go well?" I asked, making small talk. "Yeah, great trip," David said, pulling off his pack. "Weather held out mostly." "Anything unusual?" I probed, trying to keep my tone casual. Eleanor paused. "Well, not really. Though, on the first morning, right after we started, just past the kiosk, we thought we heard someone behind us.